What I would like to mention and to suggest as the main difference between Shi'ism and Sunnism is not very far from this, but I think one point here is usually neglected, but it is like blood running through the whole body of Shi'ism, and that is the one which I'm going to mention. But let me, before mentioning that important point, just draw your attention to the history of Shi'ism, because they were a minority, and an active minority, a protesting minority. Now, of course, they used their history very well in order to, as I said, to assert their identity and their place in the whole body of Islamic history. Look, 3 caliphs of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, al-Khulafa al-Rashidin, 3 of them were murdered, were assassinated. Omar was assassinated by an Iranian. Usman was, of course, killed and murdered in an uprising among the people of his time because of his misbehavior or whatever. And Ali also was assassinated by a Khariji, Ibn Muljam. So this is a very well recorded history, no doubt about it. But look at the reaction and at the behavior of the Sunni sect of Islam, Sunni branch of Islam, and the Shi'i branch of Islam. In the Shi'i branch of Islam, Ali is a martyr. Every year, actually, there is a big mourning, processions and ceremonies about the murder and assassination of Ali. People take part in so many, meetings and so on, beat their breast and this and that. There are a whole, tradition of poetry about the martyrdom of Ali. But the Sunni part of Islam, they have no such processions. They have no such ceremonies about the killing of Omar or either the Usman. No, much more important than that, of course, is the martyrdom of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, which is the emblem of the Shi'i history, and that was one of the main symbols of Shi'ism, the whole history of Shi'ism. Of course, it was a very tragic event, no doubt about it. But then the use of this tragic event in order to assert the identity of Shi'ism was one of the cleverest policies, yes, of Shiites. Of course, it was recommended by the imams of Shi'is, and then followed by other Shi'is, and then in the Safavid period, of course, it was in full flower up until now. But as I have indicated elsewhere, now, of course, the meaning of the symbols and everything under the Shi'i rule in Iran has changed and had to be changed, because Shi'ism was always anti-power, but now it is in power, and therefore using the Hussein history and story has got absolutely a different meaning, and they have to change the whole thing, and they are changing actually, because at that time Hussein was in the other side, and the ruler who had usurped the rulership and the power was in power. But now, of course, the situation has drastically changed, almost to the opposite. And so I'm not sure what they are going to make out from the history and story of Imam Hussein. Anyway, but let us look at the history of Shi'ism and the use that they made from the martyrdom of Ali, from the martyrdom of Hussein. And even contrary to the truly recorded history, some of the Shi'is claimed that all Imams were martyred. But even the great historians of Shi'is, even the great theologians such as Sheikh Mufid, they very clearly say that not all Imams were martyred. Not all of them were assassinated. Some of them died a natural death. But it was good for the Shia identity, to claim and try to prove to the masses that all Imams were oppressed, were under pressure, and So they were either assassinated or poisoned and so on and so forth. So this is again part of the mass history of Shi'ism, and this stems from the psychology of minority identity. When you live as a minority, you need to assert yourself, and you need a particular psychology, and you use different parts of your history, and you make and reconstruct your heroes in order to answer your needs. And this is what we call it Shi'ism nowadays. Sunnism was a majority. They have got their own problems, and I'm not going to speak to you about the reform in Sunnism, but at least they did not have this minority issue, this minority identity, and the problems associated with it. That is absent from there. Now, because of the minority identity, Shi'ism, most unfortunately, they had to actually cling to some misbehaviors, which nowadays I would say that we should be ashamed of. One of them is cursing the companions of the Prophet. That was a very, very bad thing, a very tragic decision made by whoever, I'm not sure. But anyway, that inflated the difference and the disagreements and the hostility and enmity between Shi'is and Sunnis. We have got still the problem is with us. Sometimes I hear that, for example, in Pakistan, there are Shi'is who sit in mosques or perhaps on the roof of the mosque, and they, very loud curse the companions of the Prophet, and this inflames, the fire between the Shi'is and Sunnis, and so on and so forth. So this business of cursing was very unwelcome, very unpleasant decision made by some Shi'i leaders. And still it is practiced in Iran, among Shi'is in Pakistan and elsewhere, and they curse the people who are beloveds of the Sunni majority, like the first Caliph, the second Caliph, and so on and so forth. And because of this, even some of them had to distort the history in order to fit it into some of these theological misguided ideas. So now the story is very lengthy, of course, I'm not going into that. So this is part of the Shi'i history, especially after the Safavid period. Another thing which, again, is an ugly part of the Shi'i history is the claim of the corruption of the Quran. Now, this is completely denied by the ulama nowadays. They say, no. They believe that the Quran has been unaltered, uncorrupted, and what is there has been there from the time of the Prophet. Nobody dared alter it. Nobody has corrupted it. It was the promise of God in the Quran. God had promised that He would be the protector of the Quran and this and that. But when you go back to the history of Shi'ism, when you go back to the books of some of the prominent scholars of Shi'is, such as Al-Kafi by Al-Kulayni and some other alims, they say quite explicitly that the Quran has been corrupted, has been altered. At least some of the verses, a great part of the Quran has been omitted from the Quran. And that part which is omitted actually contained verses about the Imams and their right to be the successors of the Prophet and so on and so forth. Faiz, whom I mentioned here as someone who edited the book of Al-Ghazali, he has got a book of tafsir. He was a mufassir himself. There are 12 important introductions to his tafsir. He has written himself. One of the introductions, I think that's the 6th introduction, he mentions this idea of the Quran being corrupted by others. He does not reject it. He does not say that it is not okay, but what he says is this: okay, let us be content with the Quran nowadays because our Imams accepted it. You see, he doesn't say that historically the claim is not valid. He doesn't reject it, but he says since Imams, agreed and accepted and used this copy of Quran, so let us accept it and let us not indulge ourselves over the Quran, whether it was corrupted or not. After phase, in 13th century, roughly 150 years ago, there was a prominent Shi'i muhaddis, a man who was expert in traditions of Imams and the Prophet. He wrote a book. You cannot find, the copies of the book nowadays. When I was in the Library of Congress last year, I tried to find a copy and no chance and no success. Seldom, you can find the book. The book was about, the topic of the book, actually, the title of the book is في إثبات تحريف كتاب رب الأرباب. The book is there to prove that the book was corrupted, Quran was corrupted. And he mentions 120 proofs in order to prove this idea. So the idea was still among the Shi'is, and this was one of the points that usually Shi'ism has been attacked by other major branches of Islam. But nowadays, of course, as I said, I don't think that anybody would have the same belief or would endorse, the idea that was for one time prevailing among some Shi'i scholars. Anyway, this was also part of the history of Shi'ism. Now, for me, as I see the problem, the main point of divide, the main line of divide between Shi'i and Sunni is neither the historical event of successorship. It is anyway over, and we cannot discuss it anymore. It's not useful. And that is not really the case. The main line of divide is that according to the theory of Imamat in Shi'ism, the prophet being the last prophet is, the idea of the prophet being the last prophet is somehow mellowed and somehow diluted. This is how I see it, if not disproved, This is a very well-known idea in the Quran and among all Muslims, that the Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet. He was the seal of prophet, according to the Quran, Khatam al-Nabiyyin. Now, this is, of course,